As some of you know, for the last 12 years, I have been serving an ethical society before accepting the call to come and serve this congregation. Because of that, I have had many conversations with ethical culturists who are a little suspicious of Unitarian Universalism. For that matter, I've had conversations over the years with Unitarian Universalists who are suspicious of Unitarian Universalism. And it has been helpful in those moments to remind them of Unitarian Universalism's history as a covenantal faith, not a creedal one. That's unusual for faiths, particularly those that emerge out of Christian tradition, that rather than a creed, a set of beliefs that we ascribe to as members, instead we are bound together by our covenant, by the promises we make to each other, by our choice to move together through life. That covenantal nature is part of what made us heretics in our early history, and it's part of what has allowed Unitarian Universalism now to be a faith open to Muslim Unitarian Universalists and Jewish Unitarian Universalists, to Hindus and atheists and agnostics. Because it isn't about the set of beliefs that you bring with you or that you discover within and among us. It's about being together, about how we are together as a community. Now, often we think about covenants as really a set of written promises, explicit ways that we choose to be together in community. And UUCA has one of those covenants, a congregational covenant. I had the chance this last week to have some conversation with the person who was in charge of the task force that created this covenant probably about 15 years ago. She explained to me that the covenant came out of a time of congregational conflict, when UUCA's leadership wanted to come up with a way to do things differently next time, perhaps to do it better. And so they created this congregational covenant, a series of ways to be together, ways we wanted to speak to each other with respect and kindness and love. As I hear it told, that covenant is often recited aloud at the beginning of annual meetings here at UUCA. A reminder, perhaps as the congregation is moving into a tense or difficult conversation about our core values as a community, how we want to be together. The thing is, we don't really want covenants to feel central and important only when we think there might be a problem coming up, or even worse, when we are in the midst of a problem. We want covenants to feel alive at all times in our community. And so I started thinking about the other ways that covenant might show up in the UUCA congregation. Many of you have talked to me about your covenant groups, about the small groups that meet for at least a year together, talking about big questions and getting to know each other deeply. You've told me that those covenant groups are among the ways you feel most connected at UUCA. Now, some covenant groups do have an explicit covenant that they've created and written down together. But for many covenant groups, their covenant is what I might call implicit. Their covenant is alive in the way they show up each month, the way they hold confidentiality for the group, the way they listen to each other when someone is sharing their story. Their covenant isn't written down, it's lived in their being together. The Unitarian Universalist theologian Rebecca Parker has something to say about this idea of explicit covenant and implicit covenant. A number of years ago, she wrote about covenant historically. She said, as Unitarian Universalists, we most often speak of covenant as a verbal statement of promise between individuals who exercise their power to choose and thus to bring community into being. There are historical reasons why we think this way. It is an expression of the dominance of an individualistic understanding of human existence. Individual first, then community. Parker goes on, though, to explore whether that understanding of covenant is really the deepest one. She posits that covenant exists, whether it is written down or not, all the time and with practically everyone. We are born, she says, into relationship before we shape relationships by our conscious intention. We inherit covenant before we create covenant. Covenant making, then, must begin with the question, what have we been given? What is the covenant we are already in? What is the covenant we are already in? I heard a story from Laura Solomon, our ministerial intern for the year at UUCA. Laura and I have been working together over the past year, and she often passes these stories along to me, and I'm grateful to share it with you. It was attributed, I think, to Margaret Mead, though the provenance is much more complicated. Ain't that the truth with almost anything? Anyway, the way it goes is this, that we know the origin of community, of civilization, by dating the first body found with a broken and healed femur. The thing is, if just the individual matters, then if an individual breaks their leg, they are left. And perhaps at some point in human history, that was indeed how we functioned. Someone who wasn't able to keep up with the group or to find their own food was left to die. Their body would be found with a broken femur, unhealed. And so to find a body buried with a broken and healed femur, it tells us that this person's community understood them as more than an individual, understood them as part of a community, part of a covenant together, an agreement to care for each other. They brought this person food when they couldn't get it themselves. They waited until they could walk again. This broken and healed femur was the beginning of community. Now, the thing is that beginning of community, that start of what it means to be human together in covenant, in implicit and inherited covenant, well, some of us have gotten away from that. America, I would say, might be an example, or certainly white America, dominant American culture. Rebecca Parker refers to this as the individualistic understanding of human existence. The idea that we are individuals first and foremost who might choose to be in community or might not. Now, without trying to take away anybody's power of choice, I wonder if there's a different way that we might understand our being together. Juana Bordas writes in her book, Salsa, Soul, and Spirit, Leadership for a Multicultural Age, about the idea of individualist versus collectivist cultural orientations, what she calls I culture versus we culture. Bordas describes growing up with a strong sense of family and community ethic as a Latina Catholic. She writes, "We was embedded deep in my soul. I didn't understand then, but it sustained me when I left my family to go to college and live in the strange land of the I's. In we cultures, the I exists only in relationship to others, not as a separate entity. Being covenanted together, being community together, doesn't erase the individual. It's there, the I, as Bordas calls it, in relationship with others. Being covenanted emphasizes the importance of that community, that each one of us is fundamentally relational. Tema Okun is the author of a series of attributes she associates with white supremacy culture. Not the culture of white supremacists, but the culture of dominant whiteness that we might find in America, the culture that we swim in America, certainly if we are white, the culture that appears in America around us. Within that list of white supremacy culture, Tema Okun identifies individualism as one of those core cultural concepts. She describes it this way: within this culture of individualism, we might have little experience or comfort working as part of a team. People in an organization believe they are responsible for solving problems alone. Accountability, if any, goes up and down. And ultimately, Tema Okun tells us, this culture creates a lack of accountability, as the organization values those who can get things done on their own without needing supervision or guidance. Perhaps that sounds familiar if you are swimming, like me, in the dominant culture in America, bootstraps and all. Just as Unitarian Universalism was countercultural historically, creating covenantal and not creedal communities, we can be countercultural now, fighting against that dominant culture of individualism that we find in majority white America. We can choose to listen to the collectivist cultures that some of us bring with us, to the we cultures around us. We might listen even to nature. Adrienne Marie Brown is the author of Emergent Strategy, a book I recommend to everyone for everything. In the book, Adrienne Marie Brown looks for models of leadership in the natural world. She notes that although there is competition in the natural world, humans, she writes, are unique because we compete when it isn't necessary. We could reason our way to more sustainable processes, but we use our intelligence to outsmart each other. We compete for fun, for ego. Adrienne Marie Brown describes herself as a recovering, charismatic leader. In the book, Brown points to the murmuration of sparrows, to ants and bees and other social insects, successful because they are social, because they are, one might imagine, covenanted with each other, relational. So what kind of covenants do we have? How are we countercultural in this congregation? And how might we be more so? There are, in fact, many written covenants at UUCA, not just the congregational one. The board has a covenant. Laura, as ministerial intern, has what's called a learning service agreement with me as her teaching pastor, which is really a series of hopes and promises for how she might learn and how she might teach all of us too. We are covenanted as a congregation to teach her. The staff covenants together in our work with each other as a whole. And on October 18th, I will be installed as your senior minister, a covenanting together, a promise of who we want to be with each other. We will speak words at that installation. We will share real promises to each other. But just like the vows at a wedding, the promises will only come true in our living of them together, and in our messing up and returning again, our remembering that covenant is often broken, and that part of being in covenant together is recommitting, renewing the covenant over and over again. In a progressive religious tradition, we covenant with each other but also with an understanding of the sacred between and among and beyond us. Covenanting, as you might be aware, is all through the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, right along with broken covenants, just as frequently. Those storytellers and history holders knew what we know now. To err is human. To forgive, to come together again, as Alexander Pope told us, is divine. And so our covenanting is that over and over again, a remembering of our promises, a recommitment to them. One of the things I've done in the last few weeks is to ask all of you about your hopes for UUCA. One of the yearnings that I have heard is for a kind of deeper relationality, a knowing each other on core levels, and to an understanding of the congregation as belonging to all of us. There are so many individual projects and passions and ideas that come into being and are nurtured within the UUCA community. And even as I have heard people celebrate those, I hear too your hope that we can come to understand those as not our individual projects, but as part of the we that we share. Not yours, not mine, but ours. That when your project succeeds, even if mine is struggling, I celebrate you and I expect your help and celebration as well. That the congregation belongs to all of us and that we belong to each other. Not yours, not mine, but ours. And here's the real trick: to keep the ours expanding. To know that the covenants and promises made between each of us will change over time as more and more of us come in. That perhaps the language will stay the same, but the tune will change, or vice versa. To keep the we expanding year after year, even as we renew the promises we make to each other. It brings me back to Rebecca Parker's words, that we are always in covenant together, that covenant is inherited between and among us, and that it must always expand to include one more. A community based on that kind of love, the kind that welcomes in, that promises and renews those promises. A congregation built on the understanding that we are fundamentally relational. That our I exists only because of we. That we belong to each other. That is a congregation that will change the world. And that congregation is not yours and not mine, but it is ours.